Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to discover the quiet kind of happiness people often forget when Jack and Tu Tien stop rushing, slow down for one peaceful day, and realize that sometimes doing almost nothing can heal the heart more deeply than anything else. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. Morning light slipped quietly through the gaps in the old wooden door, stretching across the room in soft golden lines. It landed on the bed, on the rumpled blanket, on the floorboards that still held the coolness of the night, and on two people who, for once, were not in any hurry to rise and chase the day. There was no alarm, no sudden movement, no rushed voice reminding the other of something forgotten, only stillness. Jack opened his eyes first, but he didn't move right away. He just lay there for a moment, listening. The house was breathing in its own slow way. A bird called from somewhere beyond the garden wall. Leaves brushed against one another outside the window. The morning had already begun, but it did not feel like it was demanding anything from them. It simply waited. Beside him, Tu Tien stirred and turned slightly, her hair falling loose against the pillow. She looked toward the doorway, toward the quiet strips of light on the floor, and then back at him. Neither of them smiled immediately. It was softer than that, more like a shared recognition, the kind that passes between two people who realize at the same time that they do not need to rush. Jack sat up slowly and let his bare feet touch the wooden floor. Even that small movement felt different today. Usually, mornings came with momentum already built into them. Stand up, wash, dress, cook, work, think ahead, keep moving. But this morning, each movement felt newly chosen. He stood not because time was pushing him, but because he wanted to meet the day gently. Tu Tien followed in that same quiet rhythm. She slipped out of bed, adjusted her blouse, and stepped lightly beside him, her breathing calm, her eyes still half soft with sleep. For a few moments, they moved around the room without speaking. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of release, full of permission, as if both of them had quietly agreed to lay down, just for one day, the invisible weight of being useful every second. The room itself seemed to approve. The sunlight grew warmer, the lingering tiredness in the corners faded, and somewhere inside both of them there was a strange, almost unfamiliar feeling. Relief. Not dramatic relief, not the kind that comes after disaster passes. Something gentler. The relief of not having to race the clock, the relief of not beginning the day already behind. Tu Tien paused near the doorway and looked back once across the room they had slept in. The blanket was still messy. A shirt lay folded over the chair. The morning light kept widening. Everything was ordinary. Yet even in that ordinariness, there was a softness she had almost forgotten could exist. Jack picked up the teapot and looked toward her. "Tea?" he asked quietly. She nodded. That was enough. A few minutes later, they stepped onto the porch together, carrying the teapot and two small cups. The front bench, old and worn, smoothed by time, sat in its usual place facing the garden. They lowered themselves onto it without hurry. Steam rose gently from the cups as Jack poured, and the cool morning air met the warmth of the tea in little swirling breaths. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. In front of them, the garden moved in its own peaceful language. Leaves shivered when the breeze touched them. A cluster of flowers nodded in the corner near the fence. The soil still looked dark from yesterday's watering. Beyond the garden wall, the world was surely waking into all its usual noise and obligation. But from where they sat, it felt far away, distant enough not to matter for a while. Tu Tien lifted her cup with both hands and closed her eyes as the steam brushed her face. The scent of tea, earth, leaves, and old wood came together so simply that it almost hurt. Jack sat beside her, one leg stretched out, one hand resting around his cup, his shoulders more relaxed than they had been in days. He looked not at anything important, but at the ordinary things right in front of him, the edge of the porch, the shifting light, the breeze moving across the grass. There was peace in that. More than peace, maybe. There was restoration. Sometimes The most exhausting thing in life was not hardship itself, but the habit of always bracing for it. This morning, neither of them was bracing. They were just sitting, breathing, letting the garden exist around them. Jack took a sip of tea and exhaled slowly. Tu Tien opened her eyes and looked far into the green. Still, they said nothing. That silence was not distance, it was trust. The kind of silence that forms when two people do not need to perform care for one another because they already live inside it. After a while, their teacups were empty, but still, they did not rush to stand. The bench held them, the light held them, the garden kept breathing in front of them, and both of them seemed to understand the same thing without saying it aloud. Happiness did not always arrive with celebration. Sometimes it came as stillness. Sometimes it was only this: a cup of tea, a shared bench, the right to do nothing for a little while without guilt. Eventually, Jack stood and stretched his back. Tu Tien looked up at him. "What now?" she asked. He glanced toward the courtyard, where thin green blades had started growing between the cracks in the bricks and around the base of the flower pots. "We pull weeds," he said. She laughed softly, not because it was funny, exactly, but because the answer felt so perfectly ordinary. So they went. In the small corner of the yard, they squatted side by side, both of them close to the ground, both of them reaching for the stubborn little blades that had worked their way into places they were never meant to grow. Jack's fingers moved carefully, separating grass from roots, loosening the soil without disturbing the flowers nearby. Tu Tien worked more slowly, but with the same patience, pulling one stalk at a time and setting it aside in a neat little pile. No one would call it important work. There was no reward waiting at the end, no deadline, no achievement to report, and perhaps that was why it felt so good. The cool earth touched their fingertips. The breeze passed across the back of their necks. The smell of crushed grass rose in small, fresh bursts each time a weed came loose. Tu Tien found herself smiling without effort as little clean patches of soil began to appear, as if they were clearing not only the courtyard, but some knotted place inside themselves too. Jack glanced at her once and noticed the calm on her face. He said nothing. He only kept working beside her. The sun climbed a little higher, warming their backs. Somewhere close by, a bird hopped across the fence, then vanished. A leaf fell. Time moved, but without pressure, without sharpness. Just enough to remind them that life could continue even when people chose to slow down inside it. When they finished with the grass, they rose, stretched their knees, and looked over their work with quiet satisfaction. It was a small difference, easy to miss, but it felt real. Then Jack picked up the bamboo broom leaning against the wall. Tu Tien took the other one. Together, they stepped beneath the old tree in the yard and began sweeping the dry leaves from the brick ground. The sound of the brooms against the courtyard rose in a soft, repeating rhythm brush. Gather, brush, gather, so ordinary that it became almost musical. The leaves scraped and rustled, light enough to dance when the wind caught them, easy enough to move aside. Tu Tien swept slowly, her gaze sometimes drifting beyond the yard, as though she were thinking through old days and letting them pass out of her one by one. Jack moved beside her, not matching her exactly, but close enough that the two rhythms blended. Each sweep revealed more of the clean, cool brick beneath. Each movement felt like making room, not only in the yard, in themselves. Sunlight filtered through the leaves above, scattering gold across the ground in broken patterns. Dust lifted, swirled briefly, then settled. The work remained small and simple, but that was precisely what made it matter. Here, life was not asking them to achieve anything, only to be present. And for once, that was enough. After sweeping the last of the dry leaves into a neat corner, they leaned the bamboo brooms against the wall and stood there for a second, looking at the courtyard as if they had done something far greater than clear a few scattered leaves. The bricks looked cleaner now. The ground looked calmer, and somehow, so did they. The sun had risen higher, but not harshly. Its warmth settled over the yard in a gentle, slow way, touching the flower pots, the tree trunk, the porch steps, and the two of them standing side by side with dust on their hands and peace in their breathing. Then a small movement near the porch pulled Tu Tien's attention. The cat was there. It had been sleeping in a patch of shade, curled into itself like a small bundle of fur and quiet. But now it lifted its head and stretched with great seriousness, as if it too had been waiting for the right moment to begin the day. Tu Tien crouched first, holding out her hand, and the cat came toward her without hesitation. Jack followed a moment later and knelt beside her. For a while, neither of them spoke. They simply stroked the animal's soft back in slow, steady motions. The cat settled between them, eyes half closed, fully trusting, as if it had no doubts about the hands touching it. Tu Tien smiled down at it, and Jack watched the tension leave her face one quiet layer at a time. There was something healing about touching a creature that asked for nothing except gentleness. The cat purred faintly. Its breathing stayed slow. Its tail flicked once, then rested. Jack ran his fingers lightly between its ears and said, almost to himself, "It has a better morning routine than we do." Tu Tien laughed under her breath, because it doesn't have to think. "That sounds nice." She turned slightly toward him. "You think too much." "That's because one of us has to." She smiled and looked back down at the cat. "Maybe not today." That answer stayed with him. After a little while, the cat rolled onto its side, surrendering fully to the attention, and both of them laughed softly at the shamelessness of it. The moment felt so simple that it almost escaped notice, yet it carried a kind of quiet comfort the whole day had been building toward. No deadlines, no decisions, no performance, just warmth shared between two people and one small animal in a patch of morning light. Eventually, the cat wandered off in search of some new place to nap, and Jack stood up first, dusting his hands together. He looked toward the kitchen. "Hungry?" he asked. Tu Tien didn't answer right away, but the smile in her face told him enough. Inside, the kitchen still held a faint morning coolness, though the old cast iron pot by the stove already seemed ready for use. The room was small and plain, but familiar in the way only lived-in places become familiar. Tu Tien tied her hair back. Jack reached for the rice. Neither of them needed to discuss the meal in detail. It was already understood. Today would be simple. Cold rice pressed into the old pot until it formed a crust. Pork, fat scraps sliced thin and rendered slowly. Garlic and shallots browned until fragrant. Fish sauce, sugar, pepper, chili, brought together into a thick, dark colquette that smelled like memory and comfort. Jack moved first, scooping the rice and pressing it firmly against the sides of the pot, while Tu Tien sliced the pork fat and set the seasonings within easy reach. The kitchen quickly filled with the small sounds that make a home feel alive. Knife against board, spoon against bowl, fire catching low beneath iron, oil beginning to hiss. Nothing about the meal was expensive, nothing about it was modern. And yet, as the first smell of garlic hit the heat, both of them felt something in their chests loosen with anticipation. Jack went out to the garden and came back with a handful of water, spinach, and zucchini. Tu Tien blanched them quickly, and the vegetables brightened into a clean, vivid green that looked almost too fresh for such a poor household meal. The pork fat crackled, the shallots browned, the fish sauce deepened and thickened into something salty, sweet, rich, and familiar enough to make the whole kitchen feel like an older world had stepped quietly back into the present. Tu Tien looked over at the pot of rice and laughed softly. "It sounds happy." Jack glanced over. The crust was beginning to form, crackling lightly where the heat touched the outer layer. "That's because it knows it's about to become important." She shook her head. "You say strange things when you cook. I say honest things." She did not argue. They worked side by side without rushing. When Jack needed the bowl, Tu Tien handed it over before he asked. When she looked around for the ladle, it was already in his hand. The rhythm between them was so natural that it almost disappeared, becoming less like cooperation and more like breathing. By the time the meal was ready, the smell alone seemed enough to satisfy something old and hungry in both of them. They carried the tray out to the porch and set it down on the low step where the breeze could still reach them. The crispy rice crust came away from the pot in golden pieces. The courtyard sat dark and glossy in a small bowl, the bits of garlic and pork fat shining in the sunlight. The blanched vegetables steamed faintly, simple and green and clean. They sat close together and began to eat. Jack broke off a piece of crispy rice and dipped it into the thick sauce before handing it to Tu Tien. She took it without ceremony and bit into it slowly. The crunch, the salt, the sweetness, the smoky richness of the rendered fat, the fresh bite of the vegetables when she followed it with a mouthful of greens. For a second, she closed her eyes. Jack noticed. Good? She opened them and nodded. Too good. He smiled like someone whose day had just been rewarded. Then he ate his own piece, and for a while the meal continued in silence, the good kind, the one that grows around food that asks to be savored and a moment that doesn't want to be broken by too many words. A breeze moved across the porch and cooled the side of Tu Tien's face. Somewhere farther away, someone called to a neighbor. A motorbike passed and disappeared. The world went on. But on that porch, time felt slower, softer, almost grateful. When the plates had emptied and the last piece of crispy rice had been shared, they did not rise immediately. Instead, Jack leaned back against the pillar of the house, and Tu Tien shifted beside him, letting her shoulder rest lightly against his arm. The effort of the morning had settled into that pleasant kind of tiredness that comes not from pressure, but from presence, the kind that leaves the body relaxed instead of drained. Above them, light shifted through the leaves. If the camera had pulled back then, it would have seen a small house, a quiet porch, a clean yard, two people leaning into one another, and the remains of a simple meal that had somehow become enough. And maybe that was the whole truth of the day. Not that anything extraordinary had happened, but that nothing extraordinary needed to happen. They had stood still, swept leaves, pulled weeds, stroked the cat, cooked a poor meal with care, sat in sunlight, breathed, rested. And somewhere inside all that, both of them had found something they had been missing without even realizing it. The kind of peace that doesn't arrive from winning, achieving, or escaping, but from simply allowing life to be small and kind for one day. After a long while, Tu Tien said softly, "We should do this more often." Jack turned his head slightly toward her. "Do what?" "This," she said, glancing at the yard, the empty bowls, the quiet afternoon stretching around them. "Nothing important." He smiled. Then, in the same calm voice he had used all day, he answered, "Maybe this is important." Neither of them spoke after that. They didn't need to. The breeze kept moving through the garden. The sunlight kept warming the porch. Somewhere in the back of the house, the old clock ticked on without being obeyed. And in that gentle stillness, the message of the day became clear without anyone having to say it aloud. Sometimes standing still is also a way of moving forward. Jack and Tu Tien begin the day in an unusual way. They choose not to rush. In the soft morning light of their small wooden home, they slow down, make tea, and sit quietly on the porch, letting the breeze, the garden, and the stillness calm their tired hearts. From there, the day unfolds through small, peaceful tasks that seem ordinary but feel deeply healing. They pull weeds from the yard, sweep fallen leaves beneath the old tree, gently stroke the family cat, and prepare a humble countryside meal of crispy rice, blanched vegetables, and rich courtyard. Nothing dramatic happens, yet everything meaningful does. In doing these simple things side by side, they rediscover a kind of happiness that modern life often steals away. By the end of the day, both understand something important. Life does not always need movement to have meaning. Sometimes, standing still, breathing deeply, and sharing silence with someone you love is its own quiet way of moving forward.